Over 200 experts have shared their secrets to a successful business. Join me, Rose Davidson, as I discover how these experts took their businesses to the next level.
Talking with the experts.
Welcome to Talking with the Experts. Talking about all things business by business owners for business owners. Welcome to episode 246 with Paul Ruppert.
We recognize, who knew? This was the next stage of the adoption and usage in a different use case than what we were. We were a transport provider. Best example to look at that is we were the government building roads that trucks can run on, and then all of a sudden some guy comes in and says, my name is, and it's FedEx and UPS, and we want to take and consolidate all this stuff, and we can provide all these other additional features. And by the way, forget the roads, we're going to start building airline routes as well. Okay. And eventually Amazon looks at it. This is how the ecosystem has developed over the 20 years that I've been involved in it. So that's a very long answer to why do you want to go global from the start? Because it can be accretive almost immediately, and then you're able to grow faster. Takes it on a strategic basis, let's say commercial strategy. You are not what I would call, you're not pursuing the Ahab strategy, and the Ahab strategy is chasing the great white whale.
Talking with the experts.
Hello and welcome to Talking with the Experts. My name's Rose Davidson from rosedavidson.com, and Talking with the Experts is about all things business by business owners for business owners. And you can find it on all good podcasting streaming platforms and on YouTube. And today it's my pleasure to introduce you to Paul Ruppert. And Paul from Global Point View Limited is going to be discussing going global from the start. So whether it's via traditional sales, channels, partnerships, or alliances. And Paul is a ambidextrous executive. His career is filled with talent mixing and domain hopping. I think it might be domain hopping, but I'm not quite sure.
Domain hopping, yes.
Hopping, yeah. His accomplishments span...
Domain hopping too, but I was hoping I could get into that domain, but...
His accomplishments span the shop floor selling stereos in college to negotiating legislation on the floor of the US Senate, building out startups to $1 billion valuations, to being a board member of a global hair care company. He's been a driver in how we all use text messages, which is our SMS, my God, having developed 2 patents providing interoperability and building a business on the ground in 80 countries. Look, I'll let Paul tell you more about himself. It's better than me trying to read this resume because it's long and it's got big words and I don't want to say them.
No worries, Rose. Rose, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to your audience and be on your podcast. I'm very grateful to you. So great to be here.
Right, trust me, the pleasure's mine. I really am looking forward to learning more about all
interoperability.
Yes, that's the word. So how did you go from selling stereos to, spruiking legislation in the US Senate?
Wow. Well, first off, I'm a little long in the tooth. I sold stereos when I was in college, primarily as a need. Sometimes there are circumstances that are out of your control, and then you go down a path that you find you do very well. And that was kind of the circumstances. I happened to be born when my father was 51. And when I was a junior in college, I got a call from the bursar's office, which is kind of the accounting office at my university. And I was advised that my father hadn't paid for my tuition. And my father was a lawyer, was fairly successful, not monumentally successful. But that kind of threw me. And later, being a few years down the road, we recognized that this was the first stages of Alzheimer's. And as a result of the confusion and what was going on around that, I found that I had to go off and make a living if I wanted to continue on with school. So I put a pause in place and got a job as a teller for a teachers credit union, which I hated. But then one day, this is back in the day when newspapers had want ads on Sundays, and they were quite thick. And I was looking for my next opportunity, and I saw that there was a regional stereo store. This is back when, my British friends call it hi-fi, but in the U.S. we call it stereos back then, and it was selling stereos. And so I did that, and candidly did it miserably for about the first 6 weeks. We even had 3 weeks of training. This is how things are different back then. And the training was both in sales processes as well as technical knowledge of the product that you were selling. And the products that we were selling, a stereo is a receiver back then, a turntable back then, maybe a cassette player, and then a set of speakers. And you had a wide range of combinations. And it was very much like selling cars. And as a salesperson, you were compensated on margin and as well as volume. And as I said, for the first few weeks, I sold, literally for the first 3 weeks, as I recall, I sold not one stereo. And then by the end of 6 months later, I was the number 2 sales executive. I shouldn't say executive, sales representative in the company. And the company spread from shops in St. Louis, Missouri, which is where I went to school at Washington University in St. Louis, to Atlanta, down to Miami, and over to Houston. There were about 20 different shops, 20 different stores. And that's how I got into selling stereos. And I was successful enough to be able to save enough money. And within 2 years on, I was able to graduate from school. And a number of different stories put me on a path where I was going to Washington, D.C. I fell in love with it and decided that I was going to move to Washington, and ended up doing that. And the next job that I got was working for a U.S. senator. So even though in between I was waiting tables. So there's the moral of the story is you asked how did I start off, and going from there, and then took the more traditional career path. In my first career, I spent 10 years in the political and policy realm. I went from working for a U.S. senator as a legislative assistant, which is kind of like a sales representative, which is you're negotiating when your boss might be able to make contributions to other bills in terms of sponsorship and provide support behind that, as well as trade-offs in terms of other members of the Senate supporting your boss's bills. You in doing that type of job, as I say, it was very much like sales. Many of the things that I'd learned on the shop floor in selling stereos, I applied in the context of the horse trading, as we used to call it then, to be able to get legislation passed. And from there, I then ran political campaigns for the Republican National Committee. They put me through a program that was like a combination of grad school, boot camp, and a job. And they had a program that was training people to be campaign managers, so like overall operational executives for political campaigns, which, by the way, is mirrored completely, almost 100% match in running a startup or launching a startup, as well as people who were focusing on finance, as well as media and telecommunication, or media and communications, i.e. marketing. So did that, and then later became an economic policy development advisor for urban development for a cabinet secretary who had that remit. A guy named Jack Kemp was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and then became a trade association lobbyist, once again, a sales guy. Same idea, but you're representing a trade association of technology companies in this case. And then later, eventually, I was working in the White House. So that was my career arc in the public sector. And then I jumped into the private sector by helping launch one of the first GSM operators, a mobile telephone operator like Telstra in Australia. And this was in the mid 90s. And so I moved to California and helped launch that. And that launched my career in the private sector.
Wow, pretty amazing.
I went to grad school in between, but did those kind of things as well.
Wow, very, very impressive. Very impressive.
No need, no, just grit and somebody asked me.
Yes.
Yeah, resoluteness, resilience, however you want to call it. I'll use the term hustle. I mean, I've mentioned that about myself before in terms of, I'm just a hustling peddler. So, okay, and we move on from there.
So I guess, the topic to me, going global from the start, why should anyone want to do that rather than start, local?
Yeah. Well, let me give you another piece of insight on me. So I happen to be half French. And from the time I was 5 to about 16, my mother was dragging me to Europe with her when she would want to go visit her parents and her family, etc. And she turned that into the grand tour after fashion. So we were going to places well beyond France for 3 to 6 weeks while I was there. So that gave me a different perspective, both as a child, as an adult, and later on, when I got into the telecommunications space, I ended up taking over an opportunity where I was the international roaming director for this mobile network operator. And what does an international roaming director do? Well, they negotiate, i.e. sales again, B2B contracts between mobile network operators, so that if you're getting off a plane from Sydney and land in San Francisco, your Telstra account and your phone is going to work in San Francisco and operate under what was then called the Pacific Bell Mobile Services brand, and vice versa. So that's always been in the private sector part of my outlook, and that's reinforced in terms of my own personal perspectives that I bring to the table. And after doing that for about 4.5 years, living in San Francisco and Silicon Valley and traveling all over the world, I mean, literally negotiating this on face-to-face basis. I would take 2 weeks in Europe, come back, spend 2 to 3 weeks in the U.S. and San Francisco, and then go to Asia for 2 weeks and do that. So I left, the wisdom of large enterprises. Here I am traveling all over the world, making these type of connections on behalf of the company, driving about a $200 million revenue stream. Their wisdom was, well, Paul, we want to move you to Nashville, Tennessee, and we'd like to put you in handset distribution. And I'm like, what? This was their idea of, career development. And being the guy who at one point, before I became the international roaming director, I had been a product development director in Silicon Valley. I ended up getting an offer from a startup to be involved in messaging interoperability. And it just so happened that messaging was one of my products I had oversight of very, very early on in the messaging world, and as we see it today. And so the friend of mine reached out to me who was a venture capitalist, and he said, look, I'm about to provide a term sheet to a company that is just focusing on how VoiceStream is going to connect with Verizon. Those are two different radio interfaces, GSM to what's called CDMA in that example. And they don't recognize that there are 1,100 operators around the world that want to get into Verizon as much as VoiceStream wants to get into Verizon. Now, today, VoiceStream is T-Mobile US after some acquisitions and consolidations. And I looked at the value proposition and the technology. I was like, this is really fascinating. I've never seen anything like this before. And you're right. So if you throw my name into the hat, let's see if we can talk. And I ended up making a presentation to the board. As I mentioned earlier in our conversation, this was a cockroach startup, 12 people. They had just gotten a little over $2 million in their first round of funding. And here I am walking in, talking to the board and saying, this is going to cost you about $150,000 on travel expenses alone. But this is how the world works. And the reality is, back to why would you want to do this, even in a startup context? I provided examples of how international business is done in Europe. And from the time that you could be a 4-hour drive could take you from London to Paris to Belgium to The Hague, into Germany. And if you take a 4-hour drive in the U.S., well, you've gone from Maryland to New York City. The point being,
it's a 4 hours drive is like you don't get very far.
yeah, and you can't even make a 4-hour drive in Singapore, for example. You get the idea. And I was laying out the example that this is how business is done in Europe. And given the context of what needs to be done here and the value proposition, you got to go global from the start. And by the way, the telecommunications infrastructure, which in my view is the most complex machine man has ever created because it's constantly changing in terms of technology, commercial opportunities, etc. It's a global initiative anyways. So to think that you can just operate with this opportunity in the US is short-sighted first. And I remember this presentation I put together, and I said the second part is, why don't you start with the answer? And what does starting with the answer mean? What do you want to do with this, boys, girls? Meaning you're investing in this, and so you want to do an IPO in 3 to 5 years. You want to sell this off. Well, this is all going to generate accretive value if it's successful. And then that hooked them as to, we see your vision. We understand where you're going. Now, you can't do that with everything. If you're, a candle maker, you're not going to probably be able to go global from the start. You might, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. But in the telecommunications world, there are network effects benefits, and this gets into technology and various technologies and the ripple effects, the knock-on effects of how this can be done. And as the metric of success, within 2 years, we had about 100 customers, mobile network operator customers, spread around the world. 5 years on, after 2 acquisitions, one that I helped drive because I saw the company first, which was a French-based company, a competitor of ours. We were driving about $120 million in revenues. Of that 120, I owned about 65 million of it. So the international business, the offshore business, was larger than the North American / US Canada business. And we sold that company for $470 million at year 5. And once you start dealing with venture capitalists, there are models that they prefer, even in the context of their deal flow and making those types of investments. And it usually is year 5 has to be driving $100 million in revenues. They're looking for a 12x plus return. So if they're giving you $1 million, they want to be able to walk away with 12, 20, 50, 100 billion, whatever it might be, at the exit of the investment, whatever that exit event might look like, whether it's an acquisition or they do an IPO with eventual growth, etc. And we hit all the marks. Now, we were also lucky enough that there was a visionary executive in another company that was in the customer relationship management world. The company was called Sybase. And we literally got a call. We had other companies that were in the technology world, the telecommunications technology world, who approached us saying, we'd like to acquire you. And we were like, no, this just doesn't fit. We're going to lose our own momentum. But this guy said, you can take text messaging, layer it into customer relationship management and enterprise resource planning software, which is what he did. This guy's name was John Chen. He's the CEO and founder of what was called Sybase. And that kind of blew our minds. And luckily, we had enough vision amongst the management team and the founders, and I was just part of the management team, not a co-founder. We recognized, who knew? This was the next stage of the adoption and usage in a different use case than what we were. We were a transport provider. Best example to look at that is we were the government building roads that trucks can run on. And then all of a sudden, some guy comes in and says, my name is, and it's FedEx. and UPS. And we want to take and consolidate all this stuff. And we can provide all these other additional features. And by the way, forget the roads, we're going to start building airline routes as well. Okay. And, eventually Amazon looked at it. This is how the ecosystem is developed over the 20 years that I've been involved in it. So that's a very long answer to why do you want to go global from the start? Because it can be accretive almost immediately. And then you're able to grow faster. Takes, it on a strategic basis, let's say commercial strategy, you are not what I would call, you're not pursuing the Ahab strategy. And the Ahab strategy is chasing the great white whale or chasing the great white whales. And instead, even on the international side, I segmented our approach to smaller, medium, large enterprises, mobile network operators. So I could target smaller operators, let's say in Hong Kong or in the UK or Belgium, and land that. But meanwhile, I'd still be pursuing the likes of Vodafone or Telstra or China Mobile. And that would be running in parallel. So I was able to get to the low-hanging fruit, as it's often called, show some success, demonstrate viability and demonstrate stability in terms of our growth channel. And that way, the larger guys would become comfortable with, yes, this is a great idea. And by the way, these smaller guys are now eating our lunch competitively in our own market or markets. So we have to do this. So that's the rationale why.
Oh, yeah. I remember working for a government organisation. It's a law enforcement agency back in the 80s. And, we had teletype machines and all that sort of thing. And we had a big meeting that this enforcement agency was going to bring on the internet. And we thought, oh, my God, that just sounds so good, but it's never going to happen. But in the end, within a couple of years, we were all now talking to each other through intranets and then through internets and what comes out this year is already out of date anyway, because there's new models being made every different year or developed every year. So what you buy next year is already out of date for, the next year after that. So it's because it's just an ongoing process. It's mind-boggling how the world has just come along in leaps and bounds in 30 years. It's incredible.
Yeah, and the effects of digitalization have essentially shortened that adoption cycle to almost practically immediate, and then different types of strategies to leverage that, the fail fast phenomenon. So therefore, that also creates a faster flywheel effect, if you will. So yeah, and back to the telecommunication space, I'm sure your listeners have heard of 5G. Well, there are only a few countries and few mobile network operators that have full reach in 5G. One might be in Singapore, the other one might be in Hong Kong. I mean, these are small regions. But meanwhile, the rest of the world is still working just fine on 4G and in many cases 3G. So if you start getting into like sub-Saharan Africa and the emerging markets there, it's 3G and it works just fine, So that's why I say it's a constant ebb and flow. In terms of the development, it also is a test for a business owner or an enterprise manager in the context of how do you adapt? There's a friend of mine is a senior, he's a general in the United States Marine Corps, and something he's always told me in the context of adapt or die, and he does it in his venue and I have to do it in my venue. So
it's quite true too, because, what's been happening in the world the last couple of years or, almost 2 years, a lot of businesses haven't adapted, they haven't diversified, they haven't, gone out and tried something a little bit different because, they're frightened of getting their toes wet or they just don't have the idea or the capacity to think in the long term. And it's
it can be daunting,
I think.
Yeah, it can be daunting. What I would suggest, almost like in any other respect, if you feel overwhelmed by it, then go find an expert. Now, you can find an expert as an individual, or you can find an expert as easily as reading a book. And as you can see, I don't know, this is a video
see your
broadcast.
Library. Yes, I was going to ask you about your library. I thought, are they DVDs or CDs? Or
no, those are books. People think they're all stacked like on top of each other, but in fact, it's a bookcase And so it's a bookshelf that has a metal spine that runs up the length of it, which is about 6 feet, 7 feet long. And then there are metal plates that you hinge into the spine. So
Oh
you
yeah,
can
I saw that
vary.
making one of those. Yeah, it was on one of the
Yeah.
craft channels that I watched the videos on, and it was a wooden one. It was very innovative. I thought, how neat.
Yeah, and it works. But I was about to say that, in terms of this conversation, the line of conversation here, go read The Innovator's Dilemma by a Harvard Business School who's recently passed away, I think in 2021. His name is Clayton Christensen. And he wrote this book about 25 years ago or so. And since then, he's written a number of different books, including The Innovator's DNA, which is a way to develop your own your own capabilities in driving and harvesting and identifying innovation. But the point being is, he talks about how people and companies tend to get too focused on their performance engine. And that performance engine, let's say the candle maker example that I was mentioning earlier, and recognizing that they're just focusing on the candle maker and making candles. And then all of a sudden there's this adjacent disruptor who starts looking at the candles and starts thinking, we could probably use that for ski wax. And maybe that might be an opportunity for us to explore, or even better, especially for your Australian audience, surfboard waxing. Okay, so now you have something where somebody's just been looking at candles and the various scents and colors, or shapes, whatever it might be, and there are these guys and girls who are on the sidelines who are like, cool, we can take that and put it on a surfboard. We could put like glitter in it, and call it Cool Death or something like that. You get the idea.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the candle making business has been completely disrupted by the surf wax business. And the candle maker has essentially the same capabilities and same products, same technology, however you want to characterize it. But they didn't look beyond themselves. The proverbial look outside the box and try to figure out to do that, or just throw the box away and do whatever you want. You get the idea.
I'm a bit like that. I'm a bit throw the box away and do whatever I like. I don't like I don't like to be in a box. I think it's horrible.
I am a buccaneer at spirit as well. I mean, fortune favors the audacious.
It does, yes. One of my mentors, he's always saying the first one usually that put their hands up is the one that usually gets the golden egg at the end of the process. So
yeah, or the British SAS motto, which is "Who dares wins."
That's it. Yeah, I've always been an early adopter. I'm not. Sometimes I've been a first adopter, but normally I'm an early adopter. I usually like to leave it for a few months until the price comes down. The price point comes down a bit, but yeah, I like new things. I like to try out new things, and if I can find something shiny to try out next week, then I'll keep doing it.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're doing here as a podcast host, I mean, clearly you're an early adopter. You have like 200 plus episodes, right?
Yeah, 200. I think you're 246.
Okay, well, that's a lot. If you do what, 5 a week, maybe more?
When I started, I was doing between 5 and 6 a day for 5 days a week. When I first started, I did that for about 5 months, and it was just too much.
Yeah.
So I had a break over the Christmas period, and then COVID hit, and 2021 hit basically, and I thought, no, I'll just do it twice a week. I'll just interview twice a week, and I usually have up to 4 interviews twice a week, so it's sometimes 8, between 6 and 8.
Well, that just proves my point, as I said earlier, in terms of you got into this early. I mean, I have a good friend. His name is Graham Brown, and he runs a podcast consulting company out of Singapore. He's been doing this for 9 years, and he's done almost 2,000 appearances, either interviews or being a guest. And now what he does as a podcast consultant is not serving the podcast community, if you will. So he consults to the likes of AirAsia, Singapore Airlines, McKinsey, Accenture, white shoe firms that are now starting to look at this as a bona fide marketing channel, or communications channel, and how to be able to pivot and adjust the message based on the topic of the host, and be able to really dial in, refine their message, and be able to build that out. And he's had great success with it. And so I'm kind of like an acolyte of his. I just give him a call once in a while, and he's helped me along, and gives me advice as to who I should talk to, where to look, and be able to curate my message. So
yes, my plan for 2022 for the podcast is, as I said, to get in the top 100 in Australia by the end of the year, but also in my business that I don't, outside of my podcasting hosting, I want to be able to get other people into podcasting. So either teach them how to do it or do it for them. So offer them, a way that I could just produce it and they just have to turn up and, interview their guests and then just leave the rest to me. Because a lot of people don't have time and they don't have the tech skills to be able to do all the editing and all the things that's behind the scenes of a podcast.
yeah, the conversation's easy. The easy part, I mean, it's still work in terms of preparation, but that editing piece, I mean, when he first started telling me this is what you should be doing, and I'm like, I don't want to be doing all that. I'm and again, in my past, about now 14 years ago, I wrote a blog and even was an editor of a commercial blog. And I found, just as you were talking about earlier, it was like a shark to be able to create. And I wrote maybe 600 to 800, as I put it, 600 to 800 good words. And again, because of my background in the political world, I know a number of people now who are columnists, professional columnists. And, I would call it one in particular was a good friend of mine who I went to graduate school with. And I'm like, how long does it take you to write a column? So you publish once a week, maybe twice a week. Is like, it's about a week of work. By the time you get the idea, you're curating the idea, then you research the idea, then you start outlining, then you start looking for quotes, etc. And by the time you're actually writing and then refining, because writing is rewriting, writing is editing. By the time you get to that, it's usually about 3 to 5 days, as he put it. Then he was like, why do you ask? I'm like, because trying to write 600 good words, like one a day for a blog, this is just too much effort.
Yeah, that's why I don't blog. I avoid it because it just doesn't resonate with me. I'd rather do what I'm doing here. I'd rather meet people and rather than write about it. So
yeah, it was. I mean, I did it for about 4 years, but after fashion, I'm like, no, I got other things that I got to do, and being able to pivot. And it was also at a point where I was developing my consulting business, but relative to the ambidextrous executive, that's essentially a reference between an ability to be operating in process and polish of a large enterprise, but also have the grit and creativity of being inside startups. And that's kind of what I've done, straddled executive roles and then consulting opportunities where my clients have included MasterCard, Western Union, LivePerson, which is a large customer care and customer engagement company, as well as startups and companies in my space. So that was the motivation behind that.
It's been a very varied career path, I must say.
Well, yeah, another thing, your last guest that I was listening to, Nicole Schmitz, I believe, she was talking about leadership. And I recently read a book by a guy named Stanley McChrystal called Leadership. And McChrystal is a former 4-star general in the United States Army who ran the Special Operations Command, principally in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And he's hardly what, as he would self-characterize himself, a knuckle-dragging SF operator. And he talks about leadership in the context of there is no linear path. There are venues, like in the Army, where they have actually leadership schools. But, if you ask about, you could be a sales executive with $1 billion P&L, the question is, well, have you ever gone to a leadership school? Unlikely. Or have you ever taken a leadership class? Unlikely. So that's kind of the one of the things that I focus on in terms of being able to develop the leadership capabilities. And one of the books that, again, if you want to read something really helpful, he talks about leadership is more along the lines of a playwright and a three-act play in the context of most of the time you think of leaders and it's written from a historian's perspective. It's the unitary leader, the guy or the girl on the horse. Most cases, the writing in the historic analysis is usually about a man, the guy on the horse, as I say. And it's not one person that this is all about. The equation is about the surrounding characters as well as the opportunity. And so back to your career question, I remember he interviewed the CEO, one of the former CEOs of Ford Motor Division. And he asked, so, how did you become the chief executive of Ford? And what he was doing now was now heading up the Michigan State board for its higher education, its university system. And the guy from Ford essentially rattles off the answer, which was, well, a lot of bad decisions on my part with unexpected opportunities.
I agree. Life is full of the unexpected that happens, right. But most often there's always an opportunity if you're willing to look for it.
Yeah. And I wish that I would have had, to be honest, I studied biology as an undergraduate for the first 3 years and realized I got to get out of this because I'm not getting into medical school. I didn't have the grades. But meanwhile, I was reading things like Foreign Affairs and Business Week just for fun. And that's when it realized, the light went off. And in retrospect, I also hear oftentimes about, the value of mentors and mentorships. I'm like, I've never had a mentor. Where are these mentors hanging around in your career? Didn't have that. And even in the context, I wish somebody would have said, Mr. Ruppert, you're just not cutting it. But you seem to have all these great grades and real interest in all these other classes like history or economics. So maybe that's what you should be spending your time in. You'd probably do better than eking out a C+ in organic chemistry. So.
Well, I probably would have got a D- or something because, science is not my thing. I've never liked science. I'm more of a letters person. I like to use language. Language is my thing.
Yeah, and that's my strength as well. But I wasn't, I was being too stubborn or needed somebody to, a strong hand saying, no, that's not what you should be doing. Come on, can't you see the picture in front of you? Give it some thought.
That's it. So at Global Point View Limited, where can people find you, Paul?
Well, you can go to my website, which is globalpointview.com. And the easiest really is just through LinkedIn. And you can find me as Paul R. Ruppert. That way you won't find my doppelganger, whose name is Paul Ruppert and owns a number of different restaurants in Washington, D.C. So that's why the middle initial is used there.
Yes, a friend of mine did that too. She's got a name same as somebody that's quite in a different sort of field than she is, and so she actually put her middle initial into her name too for that very same reason.
Yeah. So or you could send me an email, and you can send me an email at pruppert, RUPPERT @gpvltd.com.
Wonderful. Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure. I have really enjoyed this discussion. It was very intellectual.
Really? Okay. Well, that wasn't the intention. I didn't know selling stereos would be intellectual.
Of course it is.
But who knows?
It is. If you can find the whys and wherefores behind something, then it's got to be
the common thread. That's right. That's
absolutely.
Right. Like I say, a hustling peddler. So, well, Rose, it's been a great chance to talk to you and your audience, and thanks again for the invitation. And good on you, I guess, is the closing.
Toodles.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining me on Talking with the Experts. Make sure you subscribe through your favourite podcast app or on YouTube, and check out my Patreon page for more value for you, or you can buy me a coffee. My name's Rose Davidson from rosedavidson.com. I look forward to your company next time when I'm talking with the experts.